Story could truly begin with the 1948 Arab-Israeli War of Independence for the State of Israel, or even before it. But for all intents and purposes, to demonstrate U.S. influence in the Middle East and what Americans will come to know as Islamic terrorism, in a twisted comparing fashion of both opposing hardline views between the neoconservatives and Muslim fundamentalists, we shall follow the introductory footsteps of BBC documentarian Adam Curtis and begin the story in 1948, not in the Middle East, but instead in the United States within a small town known as Greeley, Colorado. Sayyid Qutb, a middle-aged school instructor from Egypt, arrives in the summer and enrolls in the local state college, and throughout that year, he traveled across America and became increasingly disenchanted with its decadence, anti-consumerism, as he saw it as a weak, immoral, and corrupt society. In 1950, Qutb moved back to Egypt and became politically active, joining the Muslim Brotherhood, a transnational Sunni Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928 by an Islamic scholar and schoolteacher, Hassan al-Banna, who was gunned down in Cairo in 1949. The agenda behind the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is to make Islam a major role in governing Egyptian society. As Qutb has returned to Egypt, he had become politically active, but by July 23, 1952, King Farouk was toppled in a bloodless coup d'etat, becoming arrested by the Free Officers Movement, a group of army officers led by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who abolished the constitutional monarchy and aristocracy of Egypt and Sudan, establishing a republic, eventually rooting out the British occupation of the country. Following the coup d'etat, Naguib went on to serve as the head of the Revolutionary Command Council, the prime minister and first president of Egypt, successfully negotiating the independence of Sudan and the withdrawal of all British military personnel from Egypt. His tenure as president came to an end in November 1954 due to disagreements with other members of the Free Officers, particularly with Nasser, who would go on to succeed him as president. The Muslim Brotherhood welcomed the coup d'etat as Nasser used to go to the house of Sayyid Qutb and ask him for ideas about the revolution, enjoying a close relationship with the movement. But many members of the Brotherhood expected Nasser to establish an Islamic government. However, the cooperation between the Brotherhood and Free Officers, which marked the revolution's success, soon soured as Nasser made it clear that the new Egypt will be a nationalist, secular society that emulates Western morals, which was incompatible with the Islamism of the Brotherhood. He ended up forging an alliance with the United States and welcoming the CIA to come to Egypt and organize security agencies for the new government. Nasser had secretly set up an organization that would sufficiently oppose the Muslim Brotherhood once he came to power. At this time, Qutb did not realize Nasser's alternate plans and would continue to meet with him, sometimes for 12 hours a day, to discuss a post-monarchical Egypt. Once Qutb realized that Nasser had taken advantage of the secrecy between the Free Officers and the Brotherhood, he promptly quit. Nasser then tried to persuade Qutb by offering him any position he wanted in Egypt except kingship. Qutb refused every offer, having understood the reality of Nasser's plans. Upset that Nasser would not enforce a government based on Islamic ideology, Qutb and other Brotherhood members plotted to assassinate him in 1954. The attempt was foiled, and Qutb was jailed soon afterwards. The government used the incident to justify a crackdown on various members of the Brotherhood for their vocal opposition toward the Nasser administration. During his first 3 years in prison, conditions were bad and Qutb was tortured. In later years, he was allowed more mobility, including the opportunity to write, which included a series of books, some secretly in prison, which were then smuggled out. Qutb was let out of prison in May 1964 at the behest of the president of Iraq, Abdul Salim Arif, for only 8 months before being rearrested on August 9, 1965. Qutb had called upon the revolutionary vanguard to rise up against the leaders. He was accused of plotting to overthrow the state and subjected to what some consider a show trial. The trial culminated in a death sentence for Qutb and 6 other members of the Brotherhood. He was sentenced to death for his part in the conspiracy to assassinate the president and other Egyptian officials and personalities, though he was not the instigator or leader of the actual plot. On August 29, 1966, he was executed by hanging. Sometime that same year, Gamal Abdel Nasser publicly laughed at the Muslim Brotherhood for suggesting in 1953 that all women should be required to wear the hijab and that Islamic law should be enforced across the country.
وقابلت المرشد العام للإخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب ايه؟ اول حاجة قال لي يجب ان تقيم الحجاب في مصر، وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي.
But at the same time, a blind Egyptian cleric who had been a follower of Qutb began preaching against the secular regime of President Nasser. His name is Omar Abdel Rahman, and he will become known as the Blind Sheikh, the accused mentor and spiritual guidance behind the first attack on the Twin Towers, for which we will be focusing on ahead. Another figure continuing to spread Qutb's message as a schoolboy in the beginning, after his execution, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who also became an intricate part of the same Egyptian Islamic Jihad group, formerly known as Al-Jihad, as the Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, and he will later become his mentor to a Saudi, Osama bin Laden. But the following year, after Qutb's execution, Nasser had faced defeat as the Six-Day War in 1967 broke out as an armed conflict fought from 5th to 10th of June between Israel and a coalition of Arab states, primarily comprising Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, then known as the United Arab Republic. Israel launched a series of airstrikes, first against Egyptian airfields, initially claiming that it had been attacked by Egypt, but later stating that the airstrikes were preemptive. The question of which side caused the war remains one of a number of controversies relating to the conflict. Egypt and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire on the 8th June, and Syria agreed on the 9th. A ceasefire was signed with Israel on June 11. In the aftermath of the war, Israel crippled the entirety of Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordan militaries. The war saw over 20,000 Arab troops killed, mostly Egyptians, while Israel lost fewer than 1,000. It was a crushing blow for Nasser and the country of Egypt, as well as Arab nationalism. But on the side of the Palestinians, it was also a crushing blow for who will become the father of modern jihad, the founding ideologist or demagogue for Hamas, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, who as a child pushed out of his hometown by Israel during this Six-Day War. He will become the primary teacher and mentor of Osama bin Laden and developer of Al-Qaeda as a militant movement. In the mid-1950s, Azzam joined the Muslim Brotherhood after being influenced by the writings of Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, and other members locally. He was eventually introduced to many of the Brotherhood's leaders in Palestine, becoming further interested in Islamic studies, eventually attending colleges and universities throughout Palestine, Jordan, and Syria for the next several years after. Azzam graduated in highest honors and receiving a Bachelor of Arts in Sharia in 1966. Thereafter, he returned to the West Bank, where he taught and preached in the region around the village of Silat al-Harithiyah. After the Six-Day War in 1967 ended with the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, Azzam and his family left the West Bank and followed the Palestinian exodus to Jordan. After that, Azzam himself eventually ended up in Egypt and continued his studies at the prestigious Al-Azhar University, getting a PhD in Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence in 1973, while being acquainted with the ideas of Sayyid Qutb. He completed his 600-page doctoral thesis in around 16 months. But coming back to President Nasser, dealing with the nationalist humiliation and disgrace losing in the Six-Day War, Nasser appeared on television on June 9th to inform Egypt's citizens of their country's defeat and announced his resignation. Later that day, he ceded all presidential powers to his then vice president, who had no prior information of this decision and refused to accept the post. But hundreds of thousands of sympathizers poured into the streets in mass demonstrations throughout Egypt and across the Arab world, rejecting his resignation, chanting, "We are your soldiers, Gamal." Nasser retracted his decision the next day. Known as a chain smoker to work long hours and diagnosed with diabetes, Nasser had already suffered from a major heart attack in 1966 and had a second one in 1969, putting him in bed rest for 6 weeks. But on September 28, 1970, after an emergency Arab League summit in Cairo had closed, Nasser suffered a final and fatal heart attack and died several hours later at age 52. Following the announcement of Nasser's death, most Arabs were in a state of shock. Nasser's funeral procession through Cairo on October 1st was attended by at least 5 million mourners. King Hussein of Jordan and Yasser Arafat of the PLO cried openly, and President Muammar Gaddafi of Libya fainted from emotional distress twice. Nasser was succeeded by Vice President Anwar Sadat, who was at his deathbed.